demonstrate how to plant a terrarium. Now, terrariums date back to Victorian England, and they were first used for botanical purposes to start seeds and more specifically spores of ferns. They later took on more of a decorative use and became quite common as an indoor decoration. Terrariums are simply plants grown in an enclosed container. And there's so many different types of containers that you can use, but what you really want to look for is clear glass or plastic. And so I have an example of, this would be a jar you might store your flour in. I have just a simple mason jar, a smaller container. You can of course go up to a larger vessel like a fish tank or even a fish bowl. There are the fancier Wardian cases named for the first person to make the terrarium, but those can be quite costly, so any of these alternatives work as well. Now, a terrarium can be lidded or it can be open on the top, and you'll have to adjust the plant material and your maintenance of the plants according to whether it's open or not. So once we have an ideal container, we want to get a good soil, and we want a sterile soil. An ideal soil is lightweight, has good aeration, and has organic material in it like shredded bark or peat moss. It also, the commercial mixes will have perlite or vermiculite, which helps good airflow through the soil and drainage as well. I start by dampening the soil slightly, just mixing water in a little bit at a time until it's damp but not wet. And when we fill our jar or our container with this damp soil, it won't stick to the sides as a wet material would. The other important consideration with our soil selection is that we want it to be sterilized. Now, our commercial mixes come sterilized. If you're mixing your own, you can sterilize it in the oven. But it's important because these closed systems can be prone to diseases, and so starting without the disease presence is ideal. For a small container like this, we want to start our terrariums with a clean vessel, wash it out with soap and water, and then dry it thoroughly to keep the soil from sticking to the sides. And for a small container like this, we can fill it with a spoon, or we could just make a real simple paper funnel so that we can fill it. And as we're filling, we want to think about going only about 1/4 to 1/3 the depth of the vessel, just for visual interest. In a larger container, an ideal depth would be about 2 to 3 inches. This is fairly small, so I would certainly need to select my plant material accordingly. I think I put a little bit too much in, so I'm going to dump some of that out. Now, I have a larger container, and what you'll see with this is that the moisture in the system, when we use a lidded container, the moisture is maintained, and it'll bead up on the sides and then drip back down into the soil. So we have a constant circulation of moisture in here, which means we don't have to add extra water very often. So I pre-moistened this and kept a lid on it just for visual purposes, but this is the one I would like to plant today. So now we get to plant selection. Terrariums are incredibly versatile. I put a few different groupings of plants to show how you can have many different styles. So here we have kind of a woodland selection with ferns and foliage, a little bit of mondo grass. Here I have succulents, which you would use with an open container because they like to be a little bit drier. And then in front is a little bit of a tropical mix, and that's more of what I'll be working with today. Now, to get started, you want to make sure and lay out your plants so that you know what you're going to be working with in here. And so I've set mine out in more or less the arrangement I want. I have a little bit more mondo grass than I'd like, but I'll break that up when I get to planting. You can also incorporate non-living materials. Here I've selected an interesting piece of driftwood. You could use rocks and other materials. You do want to avoid anything that is prone to molding. For example, you wouldn't want to put colorful berries in there for interest because they could get moldy. So we want to start by filling with our soil, and what I'd really like to achieve on this is raising the back a bit higher than the front. Now I'm going to go ahead and set in my driftwood in here. And so this is the front of the container and this will be the back. And I'd like to slope the soil so that the back is higher. And that's a great design method to create depth and height in your terrarium. If you think of looking into a forest, for example, where it seems to go on and on in the background, this higher soil level in the back will help with that. For planting the terrarium, we want a few simple tools that we'll have around the house. A squirt bottle, and we want to look for one that has a nice sharp stream because we're going to use that to wash the soil off of our foliage. A spoon for digging holes, and also if you're working with a narrow opening, you're going to need something to reach in there. So if you have a long-handled tweezers, that's wonderful. If you don't, you can use just a pair of chopsticks. You'll have to practice your skill a little with some Chinese food. You'll also want a little bit of pruners to clean off any dead foliage. We don't want to introduce anything unhealthy into this system. So I'll start by this small jar planting with chopstick. I'm going to start with the flat end just to kind of tamp the soil down a little bit. And if I were putting a rooted plant in here, I would create a nice deep hole to plant the plant in. But what I'm going to be putting in is a moss, and so it doesn't need a very deep planting hole. I just made a shallow opening, and using the chopsticks, I will go ahead and set it down into that opening. Sometimes you need two hands. And I'm going to hold it in place as I tamp the soil in around the edge. Go back to the flat side here. Planting in a small opening is a little bit tricky. It takes a little extra skill, practice. And you can do some really fun things though, like having those old milk jars that are large and tall with the narrow opening, have plants inside of those that look really fun. I want to use my water now to wash the soil off of the edges. I got a little bit around on the jar just to clean that up a little bit. And it's going to take a little bit of time for the moisture to level out in here, so I probably want to leave it cracked open for a day, let some of that moisture out, and then close it. And if I'm finding the walls become foggy, then I need to open it again and let some of the moisture out, maybe another day or half a day, and then close it. And once I get to the point where I'm only seeing droplets of water, then I could keep it closed, and it'll create what we call a rain cycle inside of there, where it'll just keep replenishing the moisture. Okay, now for our larger terrarium. I have all my plants set out how I'd like them, and I have my soil sloped. When we have the sloped area, one thing is to put some of your taller plants in the back, because that'll give them more dramatic height. We want to go ahead and remove the plants from their containers, and just like we would if we were planting in the garden, loosen up the soil around the roots. And then I'm going to use a spoon in this case to dig a little planting hole in here and set my plants in. Again, if I had a narrow opening, I would probably need a different set of tools to do this, but with the aquarium it's nice because you have a big wide open space. Okay, I feel like I put that a little close right there. We don't want our leaves to be touching the walls because they can actually get rotten from the moisture touching them. You see here we're real close. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that back out and move it in just a little bit. It's just something to keep in mind as you're working. Now with some of the smaller containers, it's not as easily done. So, you know, for example, in this big jar I planted, the foliage is touching the wall, and I'll just have to hope for the best there. I wanted this fern to kind of reach out over the top of that rock, so I'm going to go ahead and position it so that this leaf is stretching up over, and I'll dig my hole very close to the base of that driftwood. Put it a little deeper. So you could come up with a lot of different interesting effects as you work in your terrarium. So we want to continue planting in this manner until we have all of our plants set out and laid out as we want. You know, as with any garden, you might have to try a couple of times to get it just right. Things don't always turn out perfectly the first time. When we're finished planting our terrarium, we can adorn the surface if we want with some small rock, even mosses do well in the terrarium. Anything to give it a little luster, or you can just leave the bare soil. That'll look quite nice. I do have these a little bit close together, but I don't want to overcrowd them. I want to give them plenty of room in here for their roots to spread out and grow. Once you've finished planting the terrarium, you want to use this hard stream of water to wash the soil off of the foliage. Also, if there's any soil along the edges of the glass, you can go ahead and wash it down in the same way. Now, you don't want to cover the terrarium until the foliage is completely dry. Otherwise, you can have issues of promoting mold or fungal growth in here. So we're going to leave it open, check it every day just to see if it needs a little additional mist, and then we can cover it. And again, it might take a few days of covering and uncovering to establish that rain cycle. We'll be back in a later segment to look at how we maintain and care for our terrarium.